Inside the church hallway, my mother-in-law stepped directly into my path. She leaned close, her perfume sharp and suffocating, and whispered, "You're not family anymore. You won't sit with us." Before I could even respond, my sister-in-law's voice cut through the quiet like a slap. She didn't bother whispering. She shouldn't even be here. Dad wouldn't want that. I looked down at the funeral program clutched in my hands. My name was there, barely, buried at the bottom and misspelled. Not by accident. Guests in the hallway turned their heads as I was told, firmly, to move to the back row. My cheeks burned. My throat tightened. Then someone near the entrance said 5 words that changed everything. "The lawyer just arrived." And, just like that, the air in that hallway shifted. My name is Danielle Harper, and I'm 34 years old. I teach high school English at a public school about 20 minutes outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm practical. I drive a 10-year-old Honda. I grade papers at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and a red pen. I'm not flashy, not dramatic, not the type who walks into a room and demands attention. I never have been. I married my husband, Craig, 8 years ago. We met through a mutual friend at a barbecue, and, honestly, it wasn't love at first sight. It was more like a slow, steady warmth that grew into something I trusted. Craig was kind in a way that felt rare. He listened when I talked about my students. He remembered the little things. I thought that kindness was something he inherited from his family. I was wrong. From the very first dinner at their house, Craig's family made it clear I wasn't what they had pictured. His mother, Vivian, looked me up and down when I walked through the door and said, "Oh, Craig mentioned you were simple." She said it with a smile, the kind that's sharper than a frown. His sister, Gretchen, was worse. She didn't hide it behind politeness. She asked me where I went to school, how much I made, whether I rented or owned. When I told her I was a teacher, she tilted her head and said, "That's sweet." Like I'd told her I collected stamps. The Harpers were old money. Not billionaires, but comfortable in a way that made them believe comfort was the same as worth. They had a family business, a chain of regional insurance offices that had been running for decades. They wore their last name like a badge. And I didn't fit the image. I was too quiet. Too ordinary. Not from the right neighborhood, the right school, the right anything. But there was one person in that family who never made me feel small. My father-in-law, Richard. He was a tall man with silver hair and a deep, steady voice. He didn't say much at family dinners, but when he spoke, people listened. The difference between Richard and the rest of the Harpers was simple. He actually cared about people beyond what they could offer him. He'd ask me about my students. Not politely, not to fill silence, but genuinely. He wanted to know which ones were struggling, which ones surprised me, which ones reminded me why I kept teaching. He knew I had a small dream of publishing a book someday, a collection of personal essays about growing up in a working-class family. He asked about it every time I saw him. "How's the writing going, Danielle?" he'd say. And he'd wait for a real answer. I wasn't rich. I wasn't glamorous. But I had something the rest of them didn't expect. Patience. And the ability to listen closely when other people talked too much. Over the years, I watched how the Harpers handled things. Money moved in strange ways. Business conversations stopped the moment I entered a room. Vivian and Gretchen controlled the social calendar like generals planning a campaign. I noticed patterns. I noticed who was trusted and who was tolerated. I kept my thoughts to myself. When Richard got sick 2 years ago, a slow decline that started with fatigue and ended with a diagnosis no one wanted to hear, I was the one who drove him to his appointments. Not Craig, who was buried in work. Not Gretchen, who said hospitals made her anxious. Not Vivian, who couldn't handle seeing him that way. Me. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I picked him up, drove him across town, sat in waiting rooms reading paperback novels while he met with his doctors. Sometimes we'd stop for soup on the way home. He'd tell me stories about building the business, about his own father, about the mistakes he wished he could undo. I never fought for attention in that family. I never demanded a place at the table. I believed that loyalty would speak for itself. I had no idea that the day of his funeral would test every ounce of my self-respect. And I had no idea what he had quietly put in place before he passed. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own marriage or relationship, you know how heavy that silence can feel. It sits on your chest. It follows you into every room. I was never the loud one. I was never the one who demanded to be seen. But that didn't mean I was powerless. If you've ever been underestimated because you didn't come from money or status, because you didn't fit someone else's picture of what good enough looks like, hit that subscribe button right now. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been treated like you didn't belong? Like you were invisible in a space where you'd earned your place? And if this story already feels familiar, if it's stirring something in your chest, click share. Let's remind people that quiet strength is still strength. It always has been. The funeral was held at St. Andrew's Episcopal, a stone church with tall stained glass windows and dark wooden pews that smelled like lemon oil and old hymnals. Richard had loved that church. He'd been a member for over 40 years. I arrived early, wearing a simple black dress and low heels. I carried a small clutch with tissues and a photo of Richard and me from the last Thanksgiving we spent together. He'd been thin by then, his cheeks hollowed, but he was smiling in the picture. Genuinely smiling. I walked through the front doors expecting to find my seat in the front row with immediate family. That's where spouses sit. That's where I belonged. But when I reached the entrance to the sanctuary, an usher I didn't recognize stepped forward and said, "Ma'am, I was asked to let you know your seat has been reassigned." I blinked. Reassigned? He looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Harper requested that the front row be reserved for immediate blood relatives only. I stood there for a moment, processing. The usher shifted on his feet. Behind me, I could hear guests arriving, their voices low and respectful. I turned and saw Vivian standing near the side door of the sanctuary, watching me. She didn't come over. She didn't need to. The message was delivered. I walked toward her anyway. "Vivian, I think there's been a mistake with the seating." She looked at me with that same thin smile she'd worn the first night I met her. "There's no mistake, Danielle. We thought it would be more appropriate for blood family to be together today. You understand." I didn't understand. But I nodded because I was standing in a church on the day we were burying a man I loved, and I refused to make a scene. I turned to find Craig. He was near the front of the sanctuary, adjusting his tie, looking pale and lost. When I reached him and quietly explained what had happened, he closed his eyes for a moment. "Can we not do this today?" he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. He didn't say, "That's wrong." He didn't say, "You're my wife and you belong with me." He said, "Can we not do this today?" as if my humiliation was an inconvenience. Gretchen appeared beside us, her black dress expensive, her expression practiced. "Danielle, don't take it personally. It's just tradition. Blood family in the front. You're welcome to sit in the 4th or 5th row." She paused. "With friends and extended guests." I looked at her. She looked back, unblinking. I took the program from the usher's table and opened it. Inside, the family was listed. Vivian Harper, beloved wife. Gretchen Harper Langford, devoted daughter. Craig Harper, loving son. My name was nowhere. Not misspelled this time. Just gone. Erased entirely. As if I had never existed in Richard's life. As if 8 years of marriage, 2 years of hospital runs, hundreds of quiet conversations and bowls of soup meant nothing. I sat in the 5th row. I folded my hands in my lap. The service began with a hymn Richard had chosen himself, "Be Thou My Vision." The organ filled the sanctuary, and I mouthed the words because my throat was too tight to sing. The pastor spoke about Richard's generosity, his faith, his commitment to family. Vivian dabbed her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Gretchen read a passage from Ecclesiastes in a voice that sounded rehearsed. Craig sat between them, stiff and silent. 30 minutes into the service, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church opened quietly. I turned, along with a few others. A man in a dark gray suit stepped inside. He was older, mid-60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a leather briefcase. I recognized him immediately. Mr. Whitmore. Richard's lawyer. He didn't sit down. He walked along the side aisle, slowly, respectfully, until he reached the front row. He leaned down and whispered something into Vivian's ear. I watched her face. I watched the exact moment her expression changed. The composure cracked. The color drained from her cheeks like water pulled from a sink. She turned her head slowly, not toward Gretchen, not toward Craig. She looked back, over 3 rows of guests, and her eyes found me. It wasn't the look of dismissal I'd grown used to. It wasn't contempt or condescension. It was fear. Pure, unmistakable fear. And for the first time in 8 years, I didn't look away. After the burial, the family gathered at the Harper estate for a private luncheon. Private, of course, meaning I wasn't invited. Craig told me in the parking lot of the cemetery, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, his eyes fixed on the gravel. Mom wants to keep it small. Just immediate family. I stared at him. I am immediate family, Craig. I'm your wife. He swallowed hard. I know that. But today isn't the day to push back. She's grieving. So am I said. He looked at me then, and I saw it. The guilt. He knew it was wrong. He knew all of it was wrong. But he wasn't going to fight. He never fought. Not for me. I drove home alone. The house was quiet. I sat at the kitchen table where I'd graded 1,000 essays, where Richard had once sat across from me eating tomato soup and telling me about the time he almost sold the business in the 90s. I poured myself a glass of water and sat in the silence, and I thought about what Mr. Whitmore had whispered to Vivian. Whatever it was, it had rattled her to her core. That evening, Craig came home late. He smelled like wine and his mother's lavender candles. He sat on the edge of the bed and told me, carefully, what they'd discussed at the luncheon. They talked about the will, he said. Mom and Gretchen think everything will be split between me and Gretchen, with Mom managing the trust. And? I asked. And they think it's straightforward. Dad was organized. It should be clean. He paused. Then he added, almost reluctantly, Gretchen said something. What did she say? She said you'll probably leave once you realize there's nothing in it for you. I let that sit in the air between us. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I just looked at him and said, is that what you think too? He didn't answer right away. And that silence told me more than any words could have. The next morning, I overheard a phone call. Craig was in the living room, speaking with his mother on speaker, not realizing I was in the hallway. Vivian's voice was tight and controlled. Craig, I need you to listen to me. Your father was vulnerable in his last months. He wasn't thinking clearly. And Danielle was always there, always hovering. I don't want to say she manipulated him, but we need to be careful. Mom, come on, Craig said, but his voice was weak. I'm not accusing her of anything specific, Vivian continued. But if the will has any surprises, we need to be prepared to show that she had influence over him. Undue influence. I pressed my back against the hallway wall and closed my eyes. There it was. The strategy. They weren't just excluding me. They were building a narrative. If anything in the will favored me, even slightly, they would claim I had manipulated a dying man. They would paint me as the villain. The greedy outsider who preyed on a sick old man's loneliness. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. It was clarity. For 8 years, I had defended myself quietly. I had absorbed insults, swallowed my pride, smiled through dismissals, and told myself that patience was a virtue. But patience without purpose is just suffering. And I was done suffering. I stopped defending myself that day. I stopped explaining, justifying, pleading for a seat at a table that was never meant to hold me. Instead, I started remembering. Every conversation. Every document. Every quiet warning Richard had given me in the passenger seat of my Honda, his voice thin but certain. I remembered everything. At the reception that afternoon, a gathering at a restaurant Vivian had booked for close friends and family, I was technically present. Craig had insisted, probably out of guilt. But Vivian made sure I knew my place. When a cousin named Roger asked why I wasn't sitting at the main table with the rest of the immediate family, Vivian smiled sweetly and said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, some people show up for appearances, Roger. We prefer to keep this about genuine family. Roger looked confused. I sat at a small table near the window alone, with a plate of food I couldn't eat. Across the room, Gretchen laughed at something, her wine glass catching the light. She glanced at me once, the way you glance at a stain on a tablecloth. Something you intend to have cleaned. I folded my napkin neatly, placed it on the table, and smiled. Not for them. For myself. Because I knew something they didn't. And the knowing made me patient all over again, but this time, my patience had teeth. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that during the last year of Richard's illness, he had confided in me about things he'd never told anyone else. It started on a Tuesday drive home from his oncologist. The leaves were turning, red and gold along the highway, and Richard was quieter than usual. He stared out the window for a long time before he spoke. "Danielle, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without reacting." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. "There are things happening in the business that aren't right," he said. "Things Vivian and Gretchen have been doing with the accounts. Transfers that don't add up. Shortcuts with the tax filings. I've been looking the other way for too long." He paused, and I heard him exhale slowly, the way he did when his pain medication was wearing off. "I've gathered some of it. Emails. Account statements. Records of transfers that were never authorized by the board." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the only person in this family I trust to do the right thing with it." Over the following weeks, he showed me everything. Sitting at his desk in the study while Vivian was at her garden club meetings, he opened his laptop and walked me through folder after folder. Emails between Gretchen and the company accountant discussing ways to reclassify personal expenses as business costs. Transfer records showing large sums moved from the company's operating account into a private account under Vivian's name. Correspondence with a tax preparer that contained language even I, an English teacher, could tell was designed to obscure the truth. He asked me to help him organize the files. "Just in case," he said. I spent 3 evenings at his desk, sorting documents, creating a clear timeline, labeling everything. When we finished, he looked at me with tired eyes and said something I will never forget. "If anything happens to me, make sure the truth doesn't disappear. They'll try to bury it. They're good at burying things." I saved digital copies in a secure cloud folder, backed up on a flash drive I kept in my desk drawer at school, tucked behind a box of red pens and a stack of vocabulary quizzes. Not out of revenge. Not because I wanted leverage. Because a man I respected asked me to protect something, and I said yes. I didn't understand then how important that promise would become. I didn't know that less than a year later, I'd be sitting in the back row of his funeral, erased from the program, while the people who had stolen from his company wept in the front pew. But I knew something else. I knew the truth was organized, dated, and saved in 3 separate locations. And I had a plan they never saw coming. Not a plan born from anger. A plan born from a promise. The quiet kind. The kind that holds. The day after the reception, I received a phone call from Mr. Whitmore. His voice was calm and measured, the voice of a man who had spent decades managing difficult families and their messier secrets. "Danielle, I'd like to speak with you privately. Can you come to my office this afternoon?" I said yes. His office was downtown, on the 4th floor of a brick building that smelled like old carpet and coffee. The walls were lined with framed certificates and photographs of Mr. Whitmore with various local politicians and business owners. Richard was in several of them, younger, healthier, standing beside his lawyer with the confident ease of a man who trusted the person next to him. Mr. Whitmore closed the door and gestured to a leather chair across from his desk. He sat down slowly, removed his glasses, cleaned them with a cloth, and placed them back on his face. "I've known Richard for over 30 years, he said. "I drew up his first business contract. I was there when he incorporated the insurance group. I handled his estate planning from the very beginning." He folded his hands on the desk. "He trusted you, Danielle. That wasn't random. That wasn't the confusion of a sick man. That was deliberate." I felt my chest tighten. Not from sadness. From being seen. "He updated his will 6 months before he passed," Mr. Whitmore continued. "He came to this office 3 times to make sure every detail was correct. He was clear-minded, thorough, and very specific about his intentions." "Does the family know?" I asked. "They know a will exists. They assume it follows the pattern of the previous version, which split everything between Vivian, Gretchen, and Craig. They have no idea it was changed." He paused. They've already contacted my office twice asking for an early reading. Gretchen called this morning to ask if the estate could begin distributing assets before the formal reading. What did you tell her? I told her the reading is scheduled for tomorrow at 10 o'clock and that all relevant parties must be present. He looked at me over his glasses. You are a relevant party, Danielle. I nodded slowly. There's something else, I said. I told him about the documents. The emails, the transfers, the financial records Richard had asked me to organize and protect. Mr. Whitmore listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Richard mentioned to me that he had concerns about financial misconduct within the business. He said he had taken steps to document it. He didn't tell me where the documents were, but he told me someone he trusted was keeping them safe. He looked at me. I assumed that someone was you. Yes. If those documents surface formally, through the right channels, there could be serious legal consequences. Tax fraud, embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty. The kind of consequences that don't go away with a good lawyer or a family name. The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy coat. I understood what he was saying. I also understood what he wasn't saying. That I held power now. Real power. Not the kind that comes from money or status. The kind that comes from truth, carefully gathered and patiently kept. The reading is tomorrow, he said. I suggest you be there early. I drove home with the windows down, the late afternoon air cool against my face. The sound of the wind was the only thing louder than my own heartbeat. That night, Craig told me the family was looking forward to getting everything settled. He said Gretchen was already talking about renovations to the family lake house. Vivian had mentioned converting Richard's study into a sitting room. They were dividing a man's life before the ink on his death certificate was dry. I said nothing. I set my alarm for 7 the next morning and laid out a clean blouse, dark slacks, and the folder. The folder I'd kept in my desk at school for nearly a year, waiting for the moment Richard told me would come. He was right. It came. Mr. Whitmore's office the next morning felt different. The same old carpet, the same framed certificates, but the air was heavier, charged with something unspoken. I arrived at 9:30. Mr. Whitmore was already there, his briefcase open on the desk, documents arranged in precise stacks. He nodded at me and gestured to the same leather chair. They'll be here soon, he said. I sat with the folder on my lap. My hands were steady. My breathing was calm. I had rehearsed nothing. I didn't need to. The truth doesn't require rehearsal. At 10 minutes to 10, the door opened and Vivian walked in first. She wore a black silk blouse and pearls, her silver hair pinned back in a way that suggested control, composure, authority. She scanned the room and saw me sitting there. Her eyes narrowed for just a fraction of a second before she arranged her face into something neutral. Danielle, she said, as if saying the name of a restaurant she'd never visit twice. Gretchen came in behind her, phone in hand, already talking. Mr. Whitmore, I hope this won't take long. I have a meeting with a contractor at noon. We're looking at redoing the kitchen at the lake house, and I want to get the permit started. She sat down without greeting me. Craig arrived last. He looked tired. He sat beside his mother and folded his hands in his lap, avoiding my eyes. Mr. Whitmore closed the door. He took his seat behind the desk and opened a file. Thank you all for being here. As you know, I served as Richard's attorney for over 3 decades. He asked me to oversee the reading of his last will and testament, which was updated and finalized on March 14th of this year. Vivian shifted in her seat. Updated? Yes. Richard made significant revisions to his estate plan approximately 6 months before his passing. Gretchen looked up from her phone. What kind of revisions? Mr. Whitmore didn't answer her directly. He began reading. The first sections were standard. Personal items, vehicles, and smaller bequests to longtime employees and a few charitable organizations. Vivian would retain the primary residence. Gretchen would receive a fixed sum, generous, but clearly defined, not a percentage of the estate. Craig would receive the same fixed sum. Then Mr. Whitmore reached the section that changed the temperature of the room. The remainder of the estate, including controlling interest in Harper Regional Insurance Group, All associated investment accounts and the lake property shall be placed in a trust. The trustee and sole supervisor of this trust shall be Danielle Marie Harper. Silence. Not the polite, respectful kind. The kind that vibrates. Gretchen's phone slipped from her fingers onto the armrest of her chair. Vivian's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "That's impossible," Gretchen said, her voice rising. She manipulated him. He was sick. He wasn't in his right mind. "This is exactly what we warned Craig about." She turned to Craig. "Say something." Craig stared at the floor. Mr. Whitmore raised a hand. Richard completed a cognitive evaluation at the time of the revision, administered by his physician. He was found to be fully competent. The will was witnessed by 2 independent parties and notarized in accordance with state law. It is legally sound. Vivian's voice came out low and controlled, but I could hear the tremor underneath. "I want to contest this. I want it reviewed." She had access to him. She drove him everywhere. She was alone with him constantly. I reached down and picked up the folder from my lap. I opened it slowly. I placed it on Mr. Whitmore's desk and slid it across the polished wood until it sat directly between us all. "Before anyone talks about influence," I said, and my voice was steady, clear, and calm, "I think you should look at what Richard actually asked me to protect." Inside the folder were printed copies of the emails, the unauthorized transfers, the tax documents, the account statements showing money moved from the business into Vivian's personal accounts without board approval. Correspondence between Gretchen and the accountant outlining how to reclassify tens of thousands of dollars in personal spending as operational expenses. Every page dated. Every email timestamped. Every transfer highlighted and annotated in Richard's own handwriting. He didn't trust everyone equally, I said. And now I understand why. Mr. Whitmore confirmed it without hesitation. Richard brought these concerns to me in confidence. The documents Mrs. Harper has preserved align with formal concerns he recorded in a sworn affidavit, which is also part of the estate file. The room was silent. Gretchen's face had gone white. Vivian's hands gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles looked like bone. Craig finally looked at me. Really looked at me. And in his eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Recognition. Not of who I was. He'd always known who I was. Recognition of what I was. Someone who had been paying attention the entire time. Someone who had never needed to shout to be heard. "If anyone wishes to contest the will," Mr. Whitmore said evenly, "the process will require full financial disclosure from all parties. Given the contents of these documents, I would advise careful consideration before pursuing that path." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. For the first time in 8 years, I was not the outsider in that room. I was not the woman shoved to the back row, the name left off the program, the spouse too ordinary to matter. I was the one holding the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was louder than anything they had ever said about me. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean across the table and remind them of every insult, every dismissal, every time they made me feel like I was less than nothing. I simply said what needed to be said. The trust will be managed exactly as Richard intended. With full transparency. Every dollar accounted for. Every decision documented. That's what he wanted, and that's what I'll do. Vivian looked at the table. Her pearls caught the overhead light, but her confidence was gone. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Gretchen opened her mouth, then closed it. For once, she had nothing clever to say. Craig walked me to my car afterward. We stood in the parking lot in the cool morning air, and he said, "I should have stood up for you. A long time ago." "Yes," I said. "You should have." He nodded. There was pain in his face, and I believed it was real. Whether it was enough to rebuild what had been broken, I didn't know yet. But I wasn't going to decide that in a parking lot. I chose not to destroy them publicly. The documents existed. The truth was recorded. If they pushed, if they tried to contest or retaliate, the consequences would be theirs to face. But I didn't need to be the one who lit the match. Richard hadn't asked me to punish his family. He'd asked me to protect the truth. And I had. I drove home with the windows down again. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, the way it does in North Carolina when the season is changing. I thought about Richard, about his quiet voice, about the way he always asked me how the writing was going. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, breathing. I walked into my house not as the woman who married into the Harper family, not as the outsider, not as the quiet one they tried to erase. I walked in as someone who had been trusted with a legacy, and I intended to honor it. Sometimes the quiet one in the back row is the one paying the closest attention. Sometimes patience isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the most powerful thing in the room. Have you ever been excluded at a moment that should have included you? A funeral, a wedding, a family dinner where your chair was conveniently missing? Being pushed to the back row hurts in ways that people don't always see. It's not loud pain. It's the slow, steady ache of being told, again and again, that you don't count. If you've been treated like you didn't belong in your own family, in your own marriage, in your own life, tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe to join a community that refuses to be silenced or erased. A community of people who know that being quiet doesn't mean being weak. Your experience matters. Even if they tried to minimize it. Even if they pretended you weren't there. You were there. And your story deserves to be heard. Click share to help this story reach someone else who needs to hear it today. You never know who's sitting in a back row right now, waiting to be reminded that they matter. Did this story hit home? Let me know by liking the video and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Every like, every comment, every share helps this channel grow and helps these stories find the people who need them most. Click share to help this story reach others who've felt the same way. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story. Your support makes a huge difference. I mean that. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for believing that the quiet ones have something worth saying.